folks, we're out on the range today and we're testing out some of that brass that I loaded up on our last episode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fire 10 rounds with this DPMS Oracle. I'm using a Vortex sight here. There'll be 10 rounds with factory Independence ammo, 55 grain full metal jacket. This is all off the bench at 50 yards, and as you can see, I'm chronographing it with my Ehler Model 33. Then I'm going to step through and fire 10 rounds with each of our reloads. That's 40 grain Nosler Varmageddons, all loaded with 25 grains of Varget powder, but different brass. We've got the Lake City brass, Federal Champion, and assorted brass, and of course the Norma. Well, let's get behind the gun, get some trigger time, see how this goes. How did it look?
3,065.
Good. Empty. There we go. That's it. This chimney trigger is really nice. Feels like I'm up. Okay, now, lower left. Feels like I'm out. Yep. That's it, huh? So let me show you what I mean by that. If we take this and we've just put a primer in, let's say, and so we just give it a little test here to see how it rests on this flat surface. Notice it's not flat. If we look at this primer, we see that it didn't seat correctly. See that? It's like on an angle a little bit. So what happened is this primer pocket is too shallow. And so this one's not going to make it out to the range. In fact, I'm going to kill this one. I'm going to fill it with oil, which will kill that primer, and the whole case gets discarded. Exact same thing with this one. Let's spend a little bit of time now going over those results. We'll start by looking at the groups. And these groups I measure in extreme spread. Now recall that these were 10-shot groups for all of the groups that I fired, save for the 8 federal champion or federal cases that I fired. In fact, the federal cases produced the smallest extreme spread, just over 1 inch. Now recall that this was fired off the bench at 50 yards. The second smallest group was fired from the Norma brass with a group just over 1 1/4 inches, 1.35 inches. Now the fact that I fired only 8 rounds from the federal brass compared to 10 rounds with all the others might seem to pose a bit of a problem, but statistically, here's how we can take care of that. First, we'll assume that if I had 2 more rounds to fire, that those 2 rounds would have been outliers. They'd have been flyers. The second smallest group that I just noted was fired using the Norma brass. Now, if we throw out the 2 worst rounds from the Norma and compare the 8 best, that puts us more or less on even footing to compare and contrast the federal brass and the Norma brass. And even when we do that, the Norma brass ends up with an extreme spread of 1.21 or 1.22 of an inch. That's still slightly worse than what we accomplished with the federal. But as I noted in my earlier video, episode 1 on this series, I put less weight on the groups that I'm firing and more weight, at least in this stage of the reloading process, and I put more weight on how those rounds performed out of the muzzle. And what I look at specifically here is not so much achieving the fastest velocities, but achieving the smallest or tightest variation in muzzle velocity. And that's shown to us using standard deviation. As I suspected, the Norma brass gave us the fastest muzzle velocity of any of my reloads. Now recall, 25 grains of Varget is the beginning load for the 223. That load using Norma brass produced a standard deviation of 28 feet per second. You know, that's pretty much the same as what we saw with the Independence factory ammo, my baseline ammo that I wanted to shoot for part of this test, which produced 26 feet per second standard deviation, which in turn is also extremely similar to what the federal brass did, giving us a standard deviation of 24 feet per second. And just straight numbers, federal again gave us the best performance, 24 feet per second standard deviation. Now, I went into this experiment with a hypothesis, and that hypothesis was that the weight, or rather the consistency of the weight of the brass cases, will translate into or correlate with muzzle velocity, consistency, standard deviation, and smaller groups on paper or on target. So we have to ask, did that hypothesis carry through? Can we assume that that hypothesis then is true? So the brass that was most meticulously taken care of or prepared was the Norma brass. and we had a standard deviation of only 1/10 of a grain. Indeed, every one of those cases, those 10 cases, was either 99.8 grains in weight or 99.9 grains in weight. So that should have produced the tightest standard deviation in muzzle velocity and the tightest groups measured in extreme spread on the target. Now, as I said earlier, I'm going to pay less attention to the group size at this point, because whenever you're shooting groups, there's a couple of additional factors that play a rather huge role. Number one is that person behind the trigger, the person squeezing the trigger. A little bit of a error in trigger squeeze, a little bit of a misalignment of the sights, slightly different sight picture, and you're going to end up placing those rounds in different places on the target. In addition to that, environmental factors, the barrel heating up, a little bit of wind compared to one round to another. See, there's lots of things that affect that. But looking strictly at the bullet's performance down the bore, exiting the muzzle, boy, there's not much change that I can do as a shooter. The wind has no effect at that point, so on and so forth. So I'm going to look at that a little bit closer at this point in our reloading. Now, the brass that should have done the worst was the assorted brass. So that's that brass that had head stamps from IWI and from PMC, you name it, all different sorts of stuff. That brass ranged in weight a full 4 grains. And indeed, its extreme spread, really wasn't that good, 2 1/4 inches. So looking at those two extremes, it looks like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That very, very well prepared brass, very consistent brass, is going to yield much smaller group sizes, more consistent muzzle velocities. But then enter Federal. The Federal cases varied a full 3 grains in weight, yet its standard deviation of velocity was the smallest of any of them, 24 feet per second, and the group size was the best, 1.03 inches, essentially exactly 1 inch. Well, then let's look at Lake City, the other brass that I haven't even talked about yet. That brass ranged in weight a full 1.4 grains. Now that's half again what Federal was, and quite a bit larger than what our Norma brass was, but its performance wasn't good at all. In fact, muzzle velocity was the worst, 45 feet per second standard deviation, and the group size was nothing to write home about either, 2.03 inches, a full 2 inch, a full 1 inch larger than we got with the Federal brass. So if we revisit that testable hypothesis I was talking about earlier, based on these results, we have to reject that hypothesis and say that, at least in this case, that the weight or consistency of the brass cases does not have a relationship on muzzle velocity, consistency of the muzzle velocity, or downrange performance as measured by extreme spread. Now, I'm not going to suggest that we just grab a bunch of brass and just start reloading it kind of willy-nilly. That assorted head stamp brass really didn't prove that that worked either. No, I think there's something to sorting by head stamp or sorting by brand. All the Federal brass here, all the Norma brass there, Lake City, and so on and so forth. Now, why did Lake City not work out that well? Well, as I was looking a little bit more closely at what I actually loaded, yes, it was all Lake City, but it was clearly very different lots of Lake City brass. To help you understand this, let's talk just a little bit about deciphering the head stamp on Lake City brass. Lake City brass will always have an LC, Lake City, And you'll also see what might look like a crosshair on that head stamp. That's the NATO mark. Then you'll also see a set of numbers, 2 numbers. And the brass that I used for this test, upon closer examination, came from, some of it was from 2009, some from 2011, some from 2005, and so I'm starting to suspect that there's perhaps quite a bit of variability between these lots, or between these different years of production of Lake City brass. If that's the case, then it's very wise for us to sort our cases by brand or by head stamp. Federal, Lake City, Norma, etc., etc. But our experiment also suggests it's not worth our while, at least in the 223, 556, it's not worth our while to go through all those painstaking measurements to sort them by weight. The reason why we would sort by weight is because we were hoping or assuming that a heavier brass case means that the volume of that case is smaller than a lighter brass case in that same caliber. That's because the outside dimensions are the same, therefore the assumption is that the heavier brass, there's more brass, it's going to be evenly distributed all along the inside of that case itself. But that may not be a justified assumption. Here's an alternative that I'd like to take a look at. What if we sorted by case neck thickness? So we would first sort by head stamp, and then within all the Norma brass, for instance, we would measure case neck thickness and sort based on that. Case neck thickness, by the way, is exactly the reason why a lot of folks, and I do, some case neck turning, is to make the case necks as consistent as possible in their thickness, so that they open up and release the bullet in a more consistent way. Well, that's my take on what happened here. Share your comments and ideas in the space below, and thanks for watching.